It began when I was 20 years ago now. I was a curious child, always wandering across our family's land and venturing into the woods beyond the grassy fields. I loved collecting rocks, watching animals, and splashing around in the streams I stumbled upon. Most of the time on my own. I never felt the need for company and didn't really notice its absence, perhaps because solitude had always been my norm. Our farm was immense, a sprawling expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The countryside was stunning, with golden sunlight highlighting rows of mint-green corn stalks that framed our backyard. My father worked tirelessly, tending to the crops with help from a handful of farmhands, while my mother managed the house and occasionally made trips into town for supplies. Together, they were a solid team, deeply in love with each other and the life they had built. During the school year, my mother or our neighbor would take me and Jacob, my only friend, into town for our lessons. Jacob was my age, and although we were close, I didn't see him often during the summers because his chores kept him busy at his parents' farm, 8 miles down the dusty road from ours. On rare occasions, our families would come together for big country dinners. Jacob and I would devour our meals quickly, eager to run off and play. I had a happy childhood filled with exploration and contentment. I don't recall ever feeling isolated or unhappy for long. The vast land we lived on kept my adventurous spirit satisfied. We lived on a single-lane dirt road, miles away from town and everything else. Behind our ranch-style house were cornfields stretching endlessly to the horizon. As a child, I often worried about losing my way in the towering green maze when I fetched my father for supper. In front of the house lay a wide expanse of flat, open grassland that stretched for dozens of acres before meeting the treeline of a dense forest. Those woods were my playground, and I spent countless summers exploring deeper into their sap-streaked depths. But this story isn't about the woods or the cornfields. It's about a house that appeared in the field across the road from ours. I was 7 when I first saw it. It appeared on a hot June night. The thick heat made it hard to fall asleep, but when I finally drifted off, I didn't sleep for long. Waking up in the middle of the night, my throat dry from the stifling air, I went to get a glass of water. On my way, I glanced out the window and froze. For the first time, I saw it. The house was massive, towering 3 stories high and reaching towards the star-filled sky. It was the largest house I'd ever seen. My little hands gripped the windowsill as I pressed my nose to the glass, staring at the dark green structure with hideous yellow shutters that framed its shadowy windows. It stood directly across the dirt road, only a couple hundred feet from our front porch. It had no porch of its own. Just a single ugly door painted the same yellow as the shutters. I was mesmerized, my mind racing with excitement and curiosity about the new mystery that had appeared overnight. At the time, it didn't occur to me to find it odd or frightening. I accepted it as something remarkable that had happened. I thought about waking my parents to show them, but decided against it. Instead, I fetched my water and went back to bed, my thoughts brimming with ideas about exploring the house. The next morning, I jumped out of bed as the sky glowed faintly with purples and pinks of dawn. I rushed to my window, relieved to see the house still standing there, dark and silent. Bursting with excitement, I raced to the kitchen and almost collided with my dad, eager to share my discovery. Pulling him to the front door, I flung it open and pointed across the road, my bare feet skimming the porch steps. My father stopped in the doorway, scanning the field with a puzzled expression. He glanced at me, worry etched on his face, then back at the empty field. He couldn't see it. I couldn't comprehend why he didn't see the house. It was right there, so vivid and real. Frustration welled up as I tried to convince him, but he dismissed my excitement, urging me to stop being ridiculous and join him in the fields if I had so much energy. My attempts to point it out fell on deaf ears. Even the farmhands who arrived later that morning showed no sign of noticing the house. When I asked Louis, one of the workers who had been with us the longest, he just tousled my hair and joked that seeing me up early was surprising enough. Despite my chores, my thoughts kept returning to the house. Its quiet presence, with 3 stories standing tall amidst the long grass, called to me. I was sure Jacob would believe me. He shared my love of adventure. I resolved to tell him the next time we saw each other. Together, we would explore the mystery. Even though I couldn't see the house from the cornfields, I could sense exactly where it stood, as though its presence was etched into my mind. The sun crept slowly across the sky, hour after laborious hour, until my dad finally announced it was time to wrap up for the day. I walked back to the house beside him, listening as he discussed the next day's plans with the 3 farmhands, reminding them what needed to be done and when to arrive in the morning. We climbed the back porch, where my mom greeted them with cold beers, their faces lighting up with appreciation. Feeling worn out and still slightly irritated, I wandered around the side of the house, eager for another look at the mysterious green house with yellow shutters. But as I rounded the corner, I froze in disbelief. The house was gone. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was imagining things. When I looked again, the field was still empty. The long grass swayed gently in a warm breeze, whispering like flowing water. I spun around, scanning every direction, convinced I must have misremembered its location. But there was nothing, just the grass stretching before me and the cornfields behind. Even the distant tree-line showed no sign of anything unusual. Frustrated, I kicked at the dry dirt. Now, there was no chance Jacob would believe me. I had been so eager to show him, desperate for someone to confirm what I had seen. I muttered a curse under my breath, my first time, and then immediately panicked, glancing around to make sure my mom hadn't heard. Her voice drifted from the porch, and relief washed over me. Emboldened, I cursed again, savoring the small rebellion and how it made me feel older. With a sigh, I stuffed my hands into my pockets and tilted my head back to watch the evening sky. To the west, near the direction of Jacob's house, storm clouds were rolling in, heavy and dark. The black masses tumbled over one another, and the air seemed to shiver as distant thunder rumbled through it. That night, the storm arrived in full force. Rain lashed against the walls, and lightning tore jagged scars across the sky, each flash followed by booming thunder that shook the house. I sat in my bed, nerves on edge, debating whether I should run to my parents' room. My dad was probably snoring through it all, but my mom might still be awake. I didn't want to admit I was scared, though, not now that I was 7. As another thunderclap rattled the windows, I forced myself out of bed and stood at my window. My dad always said that courage was about facing what scared you, so I planted my feet and stared out into the storm. The wind howled, shaking the house, and the rain pounded the roof like an army of galloping hooves. A sudden flash of lightning lit up the world, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, my heart jumped. The house was back. Pressing my hands and face to the rain-streaked glass, I peered through the storm. Its dark silhouette loomed in the distance like a gaping hole cut into the night. Another flash of lightning revealed it more clearly, and my heart raced with excitement. I wasn't imagining things. It was real. I wanted to wake my parents and prove it to them, but I hesitated, knowing my dad wouldn't appreciate being disturbed in the middle of the night. Then, the next bolt of lightning illuminated something that made my excitement curdle into fear. The front door was wide open. A deep unease settled over me. Who leaves their door open in the middle of a raging storm? The wind and rain battered the open doorway, spilling into the black void inside. A chill ran through me, and I suddenly became hyper-aware of the shadows in my room. Another flash came and I looked again. This time something was in the doorway. It was large, its shape distorted by the storm, but I could make out a swirl of colors resembling a human form. Terror gripped me, and I dove back into bed, all thoughts of bravery shattered. Burrowing under the covers, I lay there shaking, convinced I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to. By morning, the house had vanished again. Part of me felt relieved. It gave me time to process what I'd seen. My imagination tried to fill in the details, crafting features for the human-shaped blur. Still, no matter how many scenarios I invented, the reality of what I'd seen remained a mystery. At breakfast, I listened as my parents discussed their plans for the day. My ears perked up when my mom mentioned that the Bennetts were coming over for dinner. Jacob would finally visit, and I could tell him everything. My earlier fear gave way to excitement, and I scarfed down my pancakes in record time. My dad said he didn't need my help that day, so after clearing the table, I sprinted out the door. With the house gone again, the day felt like any other summer morning, bursting with possibilities. Should I go swimming? Build a fort? Once Jacob arrived, we could even reenact one of our adventures as explorers. Laughing, I raced across the field toward the woods. As I passed the spot where the house had stood, I couldn't help but wonder, what if it reappeared with me standing there? Would I find myself trapped inside it? Or would it throw me high into the air as it materialized? The thought made me quicken my pace, and I dashed past the spot without looking back. The day melted away in a haze of imagination and summer heat. I spent most of it splashing in a stream, collecting rocks, and pretending I was battling pirates. It was one of those perfect childhood days where everything felt just right, a mix of adventure and make-believe. As I lost myself in my playful fantasies, the thoughts of the house faded further into the background, swallowed by the warmth of the sun. The day reached its scorching peak before slowly beginning to cool, the horizon awash with colors that bled together like melting popsicles. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten until my stomach growled, pulling me from my game. Tossing the last of my collected pebbles into the water, I decided it was time to head home. I wondered if Jacob and his parents had arrived yet, my hunger now adding urgency to my steps. I glanced at the sky, trying to judge the time from the fading light. My rumbling stomach told me it had to be time for dinner. Emerging from the treeline, I prepared to sprint the rest of the way home, but stopped in my tracks. The house was back, but something was different. This time it was facing me. A cold unease crawled up my legs as I stared at it. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It had always faced my house before. Swallowing hard, I realized the greenhouse now blocked my view of my own home. My eyes scanned its dark, empty windows, searching for movement or any sign of the figure I'd seen during the storm. But nothing stirred. It stood completely still. I decided to walk around it, keeping a wide berth and never letting my eyes leave the front door. With every step, I braced myself, half expecting the door to fly open and something monstrous to burst out. But the door remained shut, and the house stayed silent. Once I reached the halfway point, I made a run for it, my legs churning through the knee-high grass as I focused on the safety of my front porch. I refused to look back, afraid of what I might see. Breathing heavily, I scrambled up the steps, pulling in gulps of cool evening air. When I finally turned to look, my heart nearly stopped. The house had shifted again, now facing mine once more. It felt alive, watching me like a predator. My pulse pounded as I stared, waiting for something, anything to happen. I didn't know what the house wanted, but I couldn't shake the growing sense that it was dangerous. Shaking off the feeling, I turned and went inside, where the warm, savory aroma of dinner greeted me. The air was filled with the comforting sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the kitchen. My mom smiled at me from the stove, teasing that I'd kept Jacob waiting. I muttered a quick hello to his parents, who returned my greeting with friendly smiles before resuming their talk with my parents. I made my way to the bathroom to wash up, Jacob following close behind and chattering excitedly about a fort he was building in the woods near his house. I shared my day's adventures, and we quickly began planning future sleepovers, hoping tonight would be one of them. As I dried my hands, I asked Jacob if he had noticed anything unusual on his way over. He looked puzzled, so I led him down the hall to the front door. Opening it, I pointed to the greenhouse with its yellow shutters, my voice hesitant as I asked if he could see it. He laughed, clapping me on the back, and said, "Of course he could." Relief swept over me. Finally, someone else could see it. Stepping onto the porch together, I started recounting my strange encounters with the house. Jacob's eyes widened, and a grin spread across his face as he listened. The more I told him, the more his excitement grew. He asked if I had explored it yet or tried to find a way inside. I shook my head quickly, explaining the fear it radiated. I told him something was wrong with the house, that my parents couldn't see it, and that during the storm, something inside had been watching me. Far from deterring him, my warnings only fueled his eagerness to investigate. I tried to dissuade him, but before I could say more, my dad called for me to set the table. Groaning, I abandoned the conversation, and Jacob trailed after me as we filled the water glasses and prepared for dinner. I couldn't focus on the meal. The table was laden with steaming dishes, but all I could think about was finishing quickly so Jacob and I could continue talking, and maybe even see the house up close. Ignoring the effort that had gone into the meal, I ate with a single-minded determination, shoveling food into my mouth as soon as my dad finished saying grace. My mom shot me with disapproving looks, but I barely noticed. I was too busy gulping water between bites. Across the table, Jacob was doing the same. As soon as our plates were clean, I waited just long enough to be polite before asking to be excused. My dad waved us off, commenting on my terrible table manners, but I barely heard him. Jacob and I bolted for the front door, our excitement bubbling over as we ran outside. The sky deepened into a canvas of rich purples and blues as the sun dipped below the horizon. Stars flickered above like tiny, pulsing candles, their light joining the chorus of night creatures serenading the evening. Jacob and I sat on the front steps, letting our dinner settle. The field before us sparkled with the glow of fireflies, their blinking lights dancing under the pale glow of the moon. We stared across at the dark house, waiting for some hint of movement. Jacob, full of bravado, kept talking about how we should go up to the windows and peek inside. But I shook my head, an inexplicable dread knotting my stomach. Something about the house felt wrong, a lingering unease that had haunted me since the storm. After a few minutes of back and forth, Jacob stood abruptly, declaring he'd go check it out on his own. My eyes locked on his as I urgently tried to dissuade him, but he wouldn't budge. He teased me, calling me a chicken, flapping his arms and clucking as he pranced around the porch. Even so, I refused to give in, shaking my head firmly. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, he gave up mocking me and trotted down the steps. He shot me a wink and a thumbs up before heading toward the house. My heart raced as I watched him go, torn between the instinct to stop him and the fear of what my parents would think if I tried to explain. To them, he'd look like a kid wandering through an empty field. Jacob was 30 feet from the house now, his shadowy figure blending with the twilight. I could hear him calling something to me, but the words were swallowed by the night. My palms grew slick with sweat, and panic bubbled in my chest as he slowed, now 20 feet away. This was a terrible idea, I could feel it, My fists clenched as I watched him inch closer. 10 feet now. The house loomed above him, its yellow shutters like jagged teeth glinting in the moonlight. Jacob veered toward a first-floor window, his steps cautious but steady. That's when I saw it. A faint light in a third-floor window on the far left of the house. It flickered like the glow of a candle, wavering against the darkness. My breath caught as the light began to move, drifting from one window to the next before vanishing entirely. Fear overtook me, and I shouted for Jacob to come back, breaking into a run down the steps and across the road. He paused, turning to look at me, but I kept yelling, waving my arms frantically as I pushed through the long grass. The light reappeared on the second floor, gliding past the windows and growing closer. I froze, my legs refusing to carry me any farther, terror rooting me in place. Jacob called out, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't form coherent words. Instead, I screamed at him to come back, cursing at him to get his attention. That finally worked. He glanced over his shoulder at the house before cautiously heading my way. As he moved, the light descended to the first floor, stopping at the very window he'd been about to peer into. It hung there, glowing in the darkness, and I felt its gaze. Something inside was looking at me. Jacob reached me, bombarding me with questions, but I grabbed his shoulders and spun him around to face the house. The moment he saw the light, it vanished, plunging the house into shadow. We stood frozen, panting, the silence between us heavy with fear. I asked if he had seen it, and he nodded, his face pale. Whatever was in the house had seen us, too. We were sure of it. The moonlight felt harsh, illuminating us like spotlights on a stage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Without a word, we turned and bolted for my house, running as fast as our legs could carry us. Once inside, the familiar warmth and chatter of the dining room felt like stepping into another world. Jacob and I exchanged a look of silent agreement. We wouldn't say a word about what had just happened. When our parents asked why we'd returned so quickly, Jacob's mom joked that the smell of dessert had lured us back. I forced myself to eat, though my stomach churned with unease. The sweet cherry pie barely registered as I shoveled it in, haunted by the irrational fear that someone, or something, from the house might show up at our door to expose us. After we finished eating, I asked if Jacob could stay the night. The adults deliberated for a moment before agreeing, extending the visit to 2 nights since Jacob's dad needed to borrow our tractor. The arrangement gave my dad time to finish using it before delivering it to their farm. Relief washed over me, the promise of 2 whole nights with Jacob momentarily pushing away my fear. We let out shouts of excitement, jumping and laughing, but were quickly silenced by a sharp command from my dad to settle down. Giggling, we raced upstairs to my bedroom, where we started planning the 2 days ahead of us. With so much time to spend together, we decided to begin building a tree fort in the woods the next day. Sprawled on the floor, we pressed our heads together, sketching crude blueprints with crayons on a scrap of paper. As we drew, we spun elaborate stories of who we were and why we needed the fort, inventing imaginary villains and heroic missions. Fueled by the lingering sweetness of pie and boundless childhood energy, the excitement felt almost too much to contain. It was one of those rare, perfect moments that only childhood can create, where the world feels like an endless playground shared with your best friend. Eventually, we heard his parents calling him from downstairs, reminding him to behave and listen to my parents. As Jacob went to say goodbye, I found myself wandering to the window. My heart skipped a beat. The house was gone again. Later that night, the world was silent. Jacob lay curled up in his sleeping bag, his soft snores the only sound in the room. My parents were fast asleep, and the house felt still. I wasn't sure why I'd woken up, but a sense of unease prickled at me. Even with Jacob there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was in the room. My eyes darted to the corners, the closet, and the cracked door. The shadows seemed to take on monstrous shapes before dissolving as I blinked. I thought about waking Jacob but stopped myself, unwilling to risk being called a chicken again. The feeling of being watched crept over me, settling on my shoulders like a heavyweight. My gaze drifted to the window. There was nothing, just the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the glass. No eyes, no faces, no flickering candlelight. But the thought of the house sent a shiver racing down my spine, and dread bubbled up inside me. I didn't want to think about it, not in the dark, not in the silence. Still, an invisible pull urged me toward the window, drawing me closer despite my instincts. I tried to resist, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I looked. Carefully, I slipped out of bed, avoiding Jacob's sleeping form. Each step toward the window felt heavier than the last, my mind screaming at me to turn back. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." The words repeated like a chant in my head, but my feet kept moving. Finally, I reached the window and forced myself to peer outside. My breath hitched, and I clapped my hands over my mouth to stifle a scream. My heart pounded wildly, fear clawing at my chest. The house had returned, standing in its usual spot, dark and silent, but something enormous loomed behind it. A massive figure peeked over the roof, its head spanning nearly the entire length of the house. Its eyes, huge and almost human, gleamed with an unnatural, feverish excitement. Two enormous hands gripped the roof like a child peeking over a table, the long fingers shifting slightly as they pressed against the shingles. The creature's body was so dark it seemed to swallow the light, its blackness sharp and almost painful to look at. Two glowing white eyes pierced through the darkness, their crimson irises burning with an eerie, practically neon brightness. Just above the peak of the roof, its mouth came into view. The grin was wide and unnatural, its gleaming square teeth stark against the inky black of its face. The teeth radiated a harsh, almost otherworldly light, highlighting the shadowy mass surrounding them. Frozen in place, I locked eyes with the thing, its gaze drilling into me as its grin stretched wider. The world seemed to dissolve around me, leaving only its burning stare and hideous smile. I waited for it to move, to attack, to do something, but it didn't. It simply watched, its fingers twitching occasionally as though it, too, was waiting. My fear peaked when I heard my name whispered from the crack in my bedroom door. Whipping around, my heart lodged in my throat, I saw an impossibly large eye peering through the gap. Below it, a grinning mouth curved upward, framed by a black, clawed hand gripping the doorframe. I dove into my bed, burying myself under the covers, trembling and crying. The door creaked open, and I heard Jacob stirring. Peeking out from my cocoon of blankets, I saw it standing in the doorway. The figure was tall and humanoid, its swirling, ever-changing skin a liquid mix of shadowy colors. Its face rippled with the same shifting texture, an enormous eye and twisted grin fading in and out of view. Then it spoke. Its voice was a discordant symphony, layered and distorted as though dozens of voices spoke at once through rushing water. "Come with us." Paralyzed with terror, I shrank deeper into the sheets, my throat too tight to scream. I heard movement, a dragging sound followed by a dull thud, and my entire body tensed. Sweat soaked through the covers as I debated whether to call out for my parents. Finally, unable to resist, I shifted just enough to peek out again, desperate to see if it was gone. The room was empty and Jacob was gone, along with his sleeping bag. My heart thundered as I tore myself free from the covers, and then I heard him. His voice came from the hallway, muffled and groggy as he began to wake. At first, he sounded confused, but then his tone shifted. Panic blossomed in his words, rising like a black tide. I begged silently for my parents to wake, shutting my eyes as though willing them to hear. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hall, paired with a soft, dragging sound that made my blood run cold. Jacob's voice became louder and more frantic, but it was laced with tears now, his cries faint and muted. Then, the front door crashed open, and a sudden noise made me jump and let out a tiny squeal. The thumping of heavy steps and that dragging sound moved out into the night, taking Jacob with them. I ran to the window, tears blurring my vision. There, below the moonlight, I saw it. The creature had Jacob trapped in his sleeping bag, dragging him across the porch and into the field. It was heading toward the house. The giant, coal-black figure loomed above, its crimson eyes wide with an almost sickening glee, its teeth gleaming in the silvery light. The thing that held Jacob didn't look back. Its march was steady and purposeful. I watched in frozen terror as the front door of the house opened on its own, the darkness within spilling out into the night like ink. My scream finally tore free, high-pitched and raw, until my throat gave out. I heard my parents stir in the back of the house, and moments later, my dad came rushing into my room. But it was too late. As I watched, Jacob squirmed in the sleeping bag, struggling desperately. Then, the house swallowed him, its door slamming shut behind him. He was inside with that thing. My dad grabbed my shoulders, shaking me as he asked what was wrong. Tears streaming down my face, I took one last look at the house. And then it vanished. That was 20 years ago. That night, my parents called Jacob's family and the police. I explained what I had seen over and over, but no one believed me. They dismissed it as a kidnapping, and a months-long investigation followed. Jacob's parents never spoke to me again. The house never reappeared, and Jacob was never found. The track ahead veered downward into a dark, gaping hole behind the gift shops. I froze. The black void swallowed us before I could even process what was happening. Darkness enveloped us completely. Then the shoulder restraints lifted, releasing me. Panic surged as I grabbed the edge of my seat, hearing the panicked screams of my friends behind me. The car tilted sharply, and we spun into what felt like an inline roll. I clung to the seat for dear life, my mind dimly aware that the G-forces might have kept me in place even if I'd let go. But I wasn't about to take that chance. The roll ended abruptly, and the car plunged downward. Suddenly, the space around us lit up, revealing a cavernous room with a twisting maze of tracks. The train hit the bottom of a hill, and the shoulder bars locked back into place. I gasped for air, finally breathing for the first time since we'd entered the void. The track stretched upward again, leading to another lift hill. As we climbed, I glanced around. The space was enormous, likely spanning the entire park's underground. The track looped through vertical drops and sharp turns, some twisting perpendicular to the ground. Dim, yellow lights dotted the walls at intervals, their glow weak and eerie. Many were burned out, leaving long stretches of track shrouded in darkness. In the hazy light, I saw something that filled me with dread. Far ahead, on a peak hill near the ceiling, the track abruptly ended. My stomach churned as I stared at the sharp cutoff, a stark reminder of the real danger we were in. The atmosphere shifted. Danny was screaming uncontrollably, Jesse was sobbing, and Kenji was shouting at Ethan, who was pounding my leg and calling my name. His eyes were wide, wild. He looked terrified. "What is this?" I managed to choke out. "We need to get off this ride, Luke. We have to get off now." Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. "I know, man," I muttered, my voice barely audible. "We're going to die." "I know." I shouted as the train crested the lift hill and plunged down the other side. I clenched my eyes shut, fighting back tears, until I felt the shoulder bars release again. My eyes snapped open as the track curved upward into a vertical loop. The restraints wouldn't budge. "Hold on. Grab the seat," I screamed. As we entered the loop, the train slowed. A tow cable engaged beneath us, pulling the car upward. Gravity pulled at my body as we inverted. My feet left the floor, my back left the seat, and my hair fell over my face. I clung to the edge of the seat, my hands locked in a death grip. The loop felt endless. Finally, the car leveled out, and I slammed back into my seat. My feet hit the floor, and the shoulder bars locked down again. The cries behind me became clearer. "Tyler!" He fell out. "He's gone!" Kenji screamed. He hit the track below. Ethan yelled, his face pale and frantic. His panic mirrored the wild, chaotic energy of the Ethan I remembered from childhood. The car accelerated through a series of hills, and I strained to see ahead. At one point, I thought I saw water reflecting off the track in the distance. "Luke," Ethan sobbed beside me. "What do we do? I don't want to die, man. I don't want to die." "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm scared too. I don't know what to do." We banked hard around a corner, and once again the shoulder bars released. The train veered into a sharp curve, tilting the left side parallel to the ground as it dove into a long descent. I gripped the edge of the seat as tightly as before, but this time, I forced myself to keep my eyes open. That's when I saw Ethan start to slip from his seat. I reached out and caught him, pulling him back just as the train righted itself. By the time we were upright, I couldn't tell who else might have fallen. Most of the screams from behind had faded into sobs or silence. The shoulder bars didn't lock back into place, and as the brakes slowed the car, I knew what was coming next. It was another inverted loop, taller, larger, and far more menacing. I could tell we'd be upside down for much longer this time. As the car climbed, someone behind me screamed, "Danny!" I think. I tried to take deep breaths and reposition my aching hands under the edge of the seat. Ethan did the same, his tear-streaked face turning toward me. "I don't want to die in here, man," he said, his voice breaking. I shook my head at him, unable to find any words. Tears stung my own eyes as we reached the peak of the loop. My feet left the floor before we were fully inverted, and I felt my back sliding down the seat. I thought about letting go and grabbing for the shoulder bars if I fell out. The car suddenly stopped, leaving us completely upside down. My grip on the seat was all that kept me from plummeting. I grunted loudly, the strain in my arms almost unbearable. Slowly, the car began to move again. Ethan said something to me, but I couldn't hear it clearly. I turned just in time to see him slip out of the car. One moment he was beside me, the next he was falling. I watched helplessly as he reached for the shoulder bar, his fingers brushing it but failing to hold on. He tumbled down, hitting the track below with a sickening impact. His body twisted unnaturally, and he lay motionless, staring back up at me with lifeless eyes. As the car continued through the loop, I saw the train behind us strike his body, crushing it completely. The shoulder bars re-engaged as the train accelerated through a stretch of hills, banks, and curves. For several minutes, it felt like nothing but endless motion. The restraints held us securely, but the adrenaline faded, leaving only an overwhelming, suffocating fear. I realized this section of the track wasn't just physical. It was psychological, designed to instill pure terror. Eventually, the brakes engaged, and the train slowed to a stop high up near the ceiling of the cavernous space. Ahead, the track dropped steeply, splitting into 4 different paths at the bottom. A transfer stack divided the routes, each labeled with a short section of color: red, orange, green, and blue. Kenji shook my shoulder urgently. Which track are we connected to? I studied the transfer stack. Green, I called back. Where does green go? He shouted over Danny's sobs. I tried to trace the green track through the maze of rails, losing and finding it repeatedly. It seemed to end at the lift hill I'd noticed earlier, the one with no track at the top. It ends at that hill, I yelled, pointing. Danny's sobbing grew louder. Fuck, Kenji muttered. I glanced down at my trembling hands and rubbed them together to ease the ache. That's when I noticed a small blinking panel on the wall at the front of the car. At some point, it must have flipped over, revealing 4 colored buttons and an old analog timer.